Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to this damn polytheistic crusade. I'm here with the wonderful Devin Scott, and we're going to be talking at least a little bit more about the technical details behind the Arrow Video releases of the Dollars Trilogy. We've seen the first two, Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More, arrive on UHD, and we're patiently awaiting the release of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which has hit a delay but is coming out very soon, and they're working out all the last final details. And I'm just amazed we have these in any form, because they are really revelatory in a lot of different ways. But I don't know if everybody is quite aware of how much these are really leaps forward in both picture and sound, and trying to preserve these films better and trying to undo a lot of the mistakes of the past. So I figured it would be good to have a chat with Devin and get into some of this stuff, and at least make some sort of nice discussion piece for people to listen to who are curious to know more. So Devin, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Devin Scott. I am a kind of sometime colorist slash film preservation enthusiast. I've been kind of working with the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, especially since about 2009, but really in earnest since 2019. And yeah, I've been involved with this Arrow release in a, I would say, advisory consultant fashion, somewhat in depth, since a little over a year ago, which is when the Jameses, as I called them at Arrow, invited me and my good friend Willa and over to help. And then we pulled in a couple other experts whom some of you might know, Benji Haran and Jordan Krug. We recruited them, and the two of them, being much more. As much as I consider myself somewhat knowledgeable on the subject, these two are titans and,
Yeah.
of this niche. And so the four of us were kind of, you know, we're kind of involved in a heavy advisory capacity throughout, and even you, Spencer, we managed to rope you in a bit to
Yeah.
help and provide some materials and that sort of thing. So it's been a wonderful collaborative effort on this, and I'm very proud with how everything's turned out.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, especially because I'm been kind of more on the fringes and kind of came in later. But this is the kind of stuff that I do normally, and just in my own nerdy researching, and how do I cobble stuff together, and how do I figure stuff out. So to actually be able to help a little bit, and also since I've been doing this since I first saw GBU, which was just as the 2003 version was about to come out, and then that was one of the foundational moments in my existence of, they can really get films wrong, can't they? And I've kind of been doing this ever since in varying capacities. So this has been really interesting. I still can't quite believe we have something like these Arrow releases. It feels weird.
It feels surreal. I mean, if my kind of restophilia, restoration affinity has an origin story, it was in convincing a bunch of my friends to see The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, a 35 print at a local repertory cinema in the mid 2010s, and realizing in a horror after a few minutes that it was in fact the 2002 to 2004 ish MGM version
Hmm.
that had, obviously your listeners are familiar with that version with the 5.1 score with the we're gonna have to earn it in the back left channel, everything. It's
Why kill yourself working?
if you work for a living. What's that one line by the Lee Van Cleef professor? All right, boys, come out now. I can't even.
It's like,
It's a
you
disaster.
didn't use Mickey Knox for this, did you?
It's yeah, and so ever since then, it's been a rather an obsession of mine, and so to see my obsession finally resolve itself in the most spectacular way possible is very fulfilling.
Yeah, I You're lucky you got to see that print. It's at least better than the video versions they made of it. But yeah, I saw that print too, and I took my younger sister. That was her first major experience, and I felt horrible the whole time. It was my younger sister,
Mm-hmm.
my dad. I dragged them there, and the main experience, was great. But I'm sitting there the whole time like, my pain is infinite. You don't understand. You do not listen. Those are not intrinsic gunshots to 1966. That's not no. So yeah, I've always kind of been that guy to a degree, but this was one of my formative experiences, and admittedly I did write MGM a letter when I was a teenager going, so why do you guys do this stuff? Why was this done this way? Is there any, like, is there anyone I could talk to? Maybe I was very polite. I was, of course, nervous as heck. I was like, why am I doing this? And then I didn't expect a reply, and then I got the generic form letter with the MGM logo at the top that said, please don't contact us. And I'm like, oh, okay. I think it somehow got to like just a random customer support person, or somebody somewhere who wasn't even in the right department. And they were just like, just no. So I'm like, well, at least I tried.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, I think a lot of I'm a real, obviously a nerd for these sort of things, and a lot of the times when I'm doing like my little fan cuts and stuff, it's to fix things that matter to me and no one else, and don't actually materially matter to the film. Like,
Yeah.
I think that the cut to credits in Chunking Express in the 2021 Wong Kar Wai version is bad, but it's not going to prevent me from showing someone that version, even though I have made my own. But
Yes.
it's not. I'm not going to like not take someone to the cinema so they can like not have to see that cut to credits. It's like, no, of course not. It's a rounding error on someone's enjoyment of the film. But the the things that MGM did to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and also I think the things that have been done to the first two films in the Dollars Trilogy, let us not forget them,
Oh yeah.
over the years, materially hurt them as cinema. And I think this is important, where one thing I'm radicalized on is that the extended cut of the English language version of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is a much worse movie. It's just
Yes.
an aesthetically inferior object to be enjoyed on just about any level other than pure academic curiosity. And that to me is what I find so offensive about it. And also the lack of availability of the original is a baseline for that offense, et cetera, et cetera. You know the drill.
Yeah, and then finding out what she thought was the original was actually the 1998 version, which had issues because that was MGM, like the other two films, sort of mixing and matching prints together and going, yeah, that's great. And then you're like, but that's not actually the film, is it? Like you made a new version.
Yeah, well, the 1998 version is the more I learned about it. I mean, when I was young and naive in like 2009, we used that as the reference because
Yeah,
it's
that's what you thought it was. Yeah, I had to track down that original DVD because I hadn't been able to get it first, and then you couldn't get it again. And then they were repackaging the artwork of the 1998 version with the 2004 disc inside. That was the really sneaky one. Oh, that one, because the first one I bought was like that. And then imagine trying to return that to a store and explain. I did that. It was an interesting conversation. There I was. I was
well,
like, I was like 14 trying to be like, this is actually the wrong version, and the clerk is like, what are you, no, you opened it. I'm like, but you don't understand, see, it's actually yeah, that was interesting.
the density of issues with all these films and their releases is incredible. I mean, if you remember the weird situation where MGM put out the 2014 Blu-ray with the 4K Rich Rivada-ified restoration, but then they put it out in the Man with No Name trilogy set that had like a little thing of like original mono. I forget the exact language, but and then there's two versions of it. Strangely, some printings had a terrible representation, but the original mono, and the other had a mixed fold down of the 5:1 mix,
Yeah, they
and you
had to
didn't
do
know
the
which one you were going to
second
get.
version repressing, but you were flat out of luck. So you really just had to buy the standalone version that came out later, but make sure the disc said like version 1.2. And
Yep.
then you got the I think it was Chase Audio did their restoration attempt of the mono, and that didn't turn out well, but at least it was a form of the mono mix as opposed to a down mix of the remix. And I was just, having to either watch the older versions or throw on that crummy 2004 DVD with the weird version of the Italian mono, because I was like, doggone it, I'm not listening to the remix.
Yeah, I mean, it was a real pick your poison situation for a few decades there.
Yeah.
Um, so the so to kind of address the question of how and why, most importantly, this Arrow release is superior, it might be instructive to go back to kind of the beginning of my involvement. Not to say my involvement was the key element here, but I happen to have been witness to a few events that led to this that I think are terrifically interesting. So, of course, we all know the 2017 Kino. I think was it 2017?
Yeah, 2017. It's hard to remember.
Yeah, there's so many darn years. So basically, 2014, MGM puts out the Rich Ravada version, and by that we mean it was restored by L'Imagine Rich Ravada, a technically, I think, pretty sound, but aesthetically, in terms of the color, sometimes questionable, often questionable, studio in Italy. And that version was notably yellow. They get blowback for that. Kino Lorber acquires the rights to release the film in 2017. They add a blue offset to it, which, yeah, it technically offsets the yellow, but it's a real like Simpsons episode where they get the birds to eat the lizards thing. And so it was worse, in my opinion. It was a disaster.
It was much worse. Yeah. It is.
Yeah.
It's like we get that you tried something, but you made it worse.
Just an abject failure of a release. I'm so sorry to all the good folks at Kino. And what happens is in late 2020, I think it was December, I get a call on my phone from Los Angeles. And I went, well, that's clearly spam. Let's not answer that. And then I get another call. And eventually I get I believe it's a text or email from a fellow named Blake, basically telling me, hey, in so many words, Kino Lorber is going to do a 4K at the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Can you help me make sure it isn't bad? In so many words. And so what ended up happening was I reached out to a local friend of mine, Benji Haran, who is a much, again, aforementioned, much deeper scholar of this stuff than I am, and my friend Willa, and we all we convinced Jordan Krug to join us, who knows Benji quite well, and we all kind of advised on that release, and that got to, but I think, the real hero of that release is Blake Blasingame. He did just went so far above and beyond what I think anyone should be expected to do with the budget they had in release. But I'll say that this got to the point of like the fighting in the trenches, where at a certain point I found myself trolling one of the folks at Kino, whose job it was to decide these things, when that person posted on the blu-ray.com forums, I believe, asking, hey, should we release the extended cut or the theatrical cut? And some friends of mine and I, who remain unnamed, made some burner accounts and started essentially just spamming him into releasing the correct cut. So yes, we did engage in some dirty tactics.
That moment,
I'm not going to say how many of those accounts were puppets, but there were puppets involved. And but it's what's the word? The ends justify the means. Utilitarian philosophy for the win.
Yes, at least it was put to everybody that time, as opposed to the 2017 go around when the communications back and forth were not the most helpful, shall we say.
Yeah, and so the 2021 Kino release, I think, was an absolute triumph, but that triumph was pretty much due to the immense effort and like Blake should win awards. He should win
I wish
retroactive awards for this release.
Credit this stuff somewhere, or at least say something, because I myself, I knew the work that went into it, but I didn't know the who's, the whys, the hows, and how all this came together. All you just know is it's here. So it's like I wish when efforts like that would good get put in, that at least there'd be a blurb somewhere.
Exactly. And so I mean, and so much of that release was basically just people who were very well-meaning and skilled kind of pushing against a wider framework of various companies that were kind of aligned against doing the good thing for preservation. So
Yeah.
that was very much a triumph from the ground up. And then, May of last year, Willa and I get a message from the folks at Arrow who knew we were involved in the Kino release and also had read that article that was published about us in like a Canadian newspaper like 6 years ago now, about us. That was kind of, I think, our entree into these people finding us. And so and the Arrow experience has been profoundly different than any previous version in the sense that the people at the top at Arrow know what they're doing, are willing to allocate the resources to do so. And even though there's no such thing as a smooth archival release process, a perfectly smooth one, but all the speed bumps that have come have been technical, unavoidable, or due to various like rights and region arcana. And I can basically not fault for any of the, I think, rounding error type shortcomings of this release. Those were things that were essentially unavoidable. Little things like the Italian audio for the second and third film not being included. I can say that was not Arrow's intent or their
No,
desire.
it wasn't for lack of trying.
Yes. Essentially, at all times, the people with the power to do so were doing the right thing here and doing it. I mean, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was delayed for one reason, and that was because they really wanted to get it right.
Yeah.
and I'm so happy they did that instead of pushing it out. And so at every given point, they've kind of talked to, in my opinion, the right people, often the right people being Benji and Jordan. And then I've been lucky enough to have been in a place where I was invited to this party to like pitch in what I can in my own way. And I mean, they even looped you in, which I'm so happy about because some of your contributions have been like essential.
I'm just outside. I was like, I heard a rumor. Hello. Here's a little email if you guys are still working on stuff.
And and yet it worked out. And so yeah, no, it's just a joy to see this and to see them on your shelf finally. This is a great victory for these movies. So that's kind of the story of how we got here. I think I probably glossed over a million different things, like the really good people like Matt, who I think has been a hero of just doing the sound for the sound for these releases and scrubbing them up in a way that I think is just having not had a front row seat to that, just so remarkably careful about making it sound as good as possible while respecting the traits of the source whenever the circumstances allow for that. And then Silver Salt did a ton of great work on the color, and the list goes on and on. I recommend everyone read the credits on these releases because I think these people deserve to get all the same respect as any filmmakers. So that's my rant on that.
Yeah, that's why I've been able to record my fistful review, and I literally, when I'm going over the book, I'm like, these pages here, this is just like the cliff notes. Like, read every word of these because they could really, I mean, I wish there was just a whole book. I mean, the essays are great, but I'm like, I wish the whole book was about the process because they could have done a whole book just about the process of each film.
Mm-hmm.
And the big thing with these is this is the first time somebody's put in this level of effort and reached out to other people and tried to get all the rights holders to talk together, because you got to deal with that too, because you've got them on other sides of the world with different elements. The negatives are in certain places, but MGM has certain things, and I'm sure they don't always see eye to eye. So there's so many different things. And then you have the decades and decades and decades of edits and element issues and weird versions and scraps of footage here, and of course all the dubs, which are all in different stages of quality, and they were recorded differently, and not all of them were preserved very well. And how do you find a complete a master element that looks and sounds great? Because most of them, when you have the master element, it's missing something. or it's got a few frames missing, or it's not complete, or it's got a quirk, or it's got a version, and then that gets baked in and compounded further. And it
Mm-hmm.
hasn't helped that all the past video releases and restoration attempts have muddied the waters more and more. And it's not just GPU. The other two films have multiple versions of the audio, multiple restoration attempts. Some introduced new problems that got baked in. So these are undoing a lot of stuff. They're not just UHD upgrades.
No, they're the best way I can describe it is that a good kind of attempt at a digital restoration, or at least a digital presentation, doesn't just take a previous release's like video and build upon that. That's unfortunately what Blake was forced to do with the previous release of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. To take one example, he had the flawed Imagine Retrovatic color grade. He had to essentially, it's again, I like my Simpsons references. So it's like the toilet bowl in The Simpsons that in Australia where they flush it the other way. They he got it. He wrung as much out of that as he could, but you had that generational loss of that first color grade. In this case, on all three films, they've gone back to, when possible, the restored but not color graded, and sometimes the unrestored scans, those
Yeah.
4K uncompressed scans, and then rebuilt that from scratch. Audio elements have been generally provided by MGM, and then those have been from scratch, oftentimes kind of combined with other elements, and then again processed from those raw formats into something more listenable, but still respecting the texture of the original. And the exception, I should say, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is all sourced from
Yeah.
1993 Laserdisc, which sounds terrific. And so these have been just carefully curated from the ground up. It's almost like where people think the stream splits on these is like, oh, they just took the previous version. No, it's they went back to a source from which the previous version may or may not have been spawned from, if they're lucky, and then treated it totally differently. And so you have all that, and then the encoding, right? The encoding is actually, I think, is superior to previous releases, and so you don't have that generational loss to that degree either. So it's one of those things where a lot of invisible work goes into it that can just seem like, so you only see the delta between one release and another versus the delta between the source and both those releases, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I look at it as they're doing the absolute best they can. They're putting in the work and adding the elbow grease that was necessary, but also casting the net wider to actually go, oh, well, this audio is this way. Can we find something else? Hey, do you guys have, such and such? Okay, well, there's this thing here. This section is better, but maybe it's not as good throughout as others. So we might have to do some extra work and make it a sort of patchwork affair in mixing certain pieces. But let's not do what MGM did in the past of literally just mixing prints together and saying, yeah, that's great. Because that was their whole approach that started really in when they first did the letterbox laserdisc. That was when they started
Mm.
mixing prints together. And so suddenly, for a few dollars more, went from actually being uncut, although it was time compressed and pan and scanned, to suddenly being cut, but not well. It was basically the U.S. release edit, and then when they tried to do the 1997 restoration, which came out on DVD, then it was not uncut, but it also wasn't the US release edit. It was a weird mix of the two, and it introduced that really bad audio sync problem that lasted. It was even there to a degree on the Kino. They tried to correct that some, which was good, but it still had some sync issues. GBU, as good as the LD is, it's got the Italian captions because it's using sections of an Italian print, that's really weird the first time you see it. I remember when I first got the LD, I'm like, wow, this is amazing. I've never heard it in quality like this, and it's really cool seeing this transfer. Why is that in Italian? What's going on here?
and yeah, and you can, and I mean, even like the order of shots will be mixed up at certain scenes. Like, I
Yeah,
mean,
because
we could spend a whole hour on the torture sequence of
oh,
Tuco.
oh yeah, it's practically different in every version.
Yeah, and I think the audio, like to talk about Fistful for a second, like the history of the audio in those releases is so interesting, right? Because I mean, not just mixing prints, but like mixing like a lot of the previous versions, the soundtrack would be cleaner, and so they would cut in just pure soundtrack audio or mix it in funny ways, like cause phase it. Like there's so many different things. My favorite example is of course the one of the Mondo Blu-ray releases for one of the audio tracks of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. They used the soundtrack version of the trio score towards the end, which doesn't synchronize at all and is a totally different performance and has different timing. So it's utter disaster. But the
Not as bad as the last restoration of the Fistful mono track that just was like, oh yeah, we got the stems. Yeah, yeah, the music's loud is great. Who cares if the dialogue and effects are all there? It's fine.
and there's also like there's such a spectrum of ways to do it too. Like even on these releases, you have obviously the mono stuff that we focus on, but then you have the 5.1 mixes, and for the 5.1 mixes, in certain cases, they have gone to different sources, but they've made sure that if it is a different source, it is the same performance of, for example, soundtrack song. On the mono release on the mono English track for Fistful, for example, it is a mix of 2 or 3 sources, and that is because the superior source is missing scenes. There are
Yep.
bits that were censored. And so occasionally it cuts to a slightly lower quality version, or in the opening credits, it's from, I believe, a Laserdisc in the end. And yes.
This guy right here, this exact one, which randomly has, even though it's an analog track of the pan and scan version, and it's direct print audio, so it's got tons of defects and things. That's the most untouched version of the mono of all the past releases. It sounds incredibly natural. It's not complete though, because that print was missing a few tiny little bits, and then
Mm-hmm.
randomly the last minute or so is in Italian, because even then this stuff was a problem. But yeah, that's the most untouched audio, and because of the sources not having either not having a complete version of the main title, or just plain not having the main title, because I guess it was prepared for export, and then and doing the dub and things in the different languages. So um, the best quality version of the mono film mix of the main title, with all the sound effects that are specific to the main title, as opposed to the actual soundtrack cue. Um, my capture of this guy is literally the best that you can get, although it's got a lot of high-end distortion and things that they were able to tame actually quite a bit. I was surprised how well they were able to do that without losing the character of the sound or anything. But yeah, it goes to show you that you have to dig around. I mean, I never thought this was going to be worth very much. I'm just glad I bought it in a used store, because I was like, well, it's cheap and I've not checked it. So same thing with, for a few dollars more, and how I found the audio was best on the old Key Video 1980s VHS tape, but you got to deal with the time compression. But it's uncut, and that really revealed the levels of noise reduction MGM had used, that because they remastered the audio so many times that by the time of the more modern releases, like the third MGM mono, it's got some of the worst noise reduction I've ever heard on a track, regardless of mono or discrete multi-channel. It was like, if you ever wondered why the film sounded just so thin and tinny, in addition to having the audio sync problems on a lot of releases, it's because they scrubbed it to death. I think it was also maybe because the film has all of the uh, louder passages, especially the whistling is a bit louder in the
Mm-hmm.
actual score. And I think that's also one of the reasons why it's got more distortion in the high end, which is why Arrow gave the option of having the Academy curve iteration on the UHD, because that's a track that it really is better to have good speakers with it, because if you have lower quality speakers, the reproduction of the high end is not going to be the greatest. Because I remember watching it in the past on old TVs and things, and even in the lower quality scrubbed MGM versions, all the whistling and stuff makes speakers vibrate a little if they're not the
Mm-hmm.
greatest, and it's like, yeah, I need better speakers, don't I?
It's an interesting thing because Academy Mono is one of those interesting cases of the kind of dilemmas of film preservation, right? Because if you're trying to preserve a print, well, a print will not have Academy Mono roll off because the print. And just to kind of step back here, Academy Mono is of course, a standard that was implemented in Hollywood from around the mid 30s up, and slowly began to dissipate around the late 60s. And essentially, it governed how film sounded for many years and was mostly driven by economic concerns of making everything uniform rather than chasing whatever the highest quality was. If you want the highest quality, go watch a Cinerama.
Yeah.
And so it specified a certain roll off, starting really around 2 kilohertz, but really hitting around 8. And if anyone wants more info on this, Eric Dienstfrei's book on the subject, or actually no, it's not his book. He had a book on the stereo. So Eric Dienstfrei helped kind of me learn about this in more depth, and there's certain white papers on this, and his book on the development of stereo touches on this quite a bit too. But the thing about Academy Mono is that roll-off is not applied at the manufacturing of the print stage. It's applied at the exhibition stage. So the question is, if you have a accurate representation of a digital scan of a print, you don't have that roll-off, which means you have that high end, which is often by sound engineers emphasized beyond what they would want to hear, right? It's almost that they've pre-pumped it up, knowing that it's going to be clamped down on later. And so the question is, to what degree do we try and emulate an exhibition environment? Right.
Yeah, it's like albums and the RIAA curve in terms of cutting vinyl. And
Yes.
some albums would be recorded with that mindset of, oh yeah, this is going to have to go through this. Not everything was, or when they go to pull audio elements and they got to figure out, okay, was this recorded with Dolby noise reduction in some form? It's not labeled. We got to figure it out, because if it is, then we got to factor that in. If it wasn't, then we got to factor that in as well, and not accidentally do it the wrong way. But with films, since on disc you have the ability to have multiple audio tracks, I think it would be really helpful if we could get more releases, like for a few dollars more, that if there was maybe a question, or maybe okay, well, maybe this will play nicer with modern equipment, since it's so far beyond and technical capabilities of what you'd get on a mono track on a print from 1967 in the US, or whatever they were looking at. Maybe we could see more releases like this, where you have the I guess I've always wished that we could have the purest audio option, because that's me. I'm like, just give it to me raw. I just want it exactly how it was.
I think we can learn a lot from like torrent community remixers on this.
Yes.
Where like I mean, to me, some of the greatest people working in film preservation right now are the ones on various torrent sites that shall not be named, putting like 5 different versions of the audio on, because there's so many different sources with varying different qualities. And,
I see some of that stuff, and I'm like, well, I have all of these releases, but somebody's already done the extra work for me. This is fantastic. Why couldn't this be on the official release? They had plenty of unused space.
Yeah, and audio is a rounding error in terms of space on these releases. And so, so I was very happy to see Arrow put those 2 versions on. This was a case where the audio was rough enough that it called for an attempt at the Academy roll-off. And there was a very in-depth discussion about how to deal with that. Do you just include one or the other, or both? And I'm so happy they did both, because then you, the listener, get to decide which of these 2, I think, defensible options. Like, I'm not for including like the bad 5.1 mix just because it's a 5.1 mix. And I mean the previous mixes. I think the Arrow's 5.1 mix are very tasteful. But
yes,
their inclusion is something that I could either take or leave. I don't really care if it's included. But I think that having 2 versions that both represent kind of different philosophies of how to handle that history is just a great thing, and I wish everyone did it.
Yeah, plus it gets people to think about this stuff, even if it's just they're wondering why there are two. And Arrows included a tiny little bit of text actually telling people what this stuff is, because most would not do that. And then people would really be scratching their heads. But anything to further the cause of preservation, and even if it takes a little more effort, a little more time, a secondary audio track is not going to hurt anybody. They don't take up that much space. Just go ahead, and if people want to know more, they can actually start digging into this stuff, and it just gets people more in the mindset of this stuff. In a lot of ways is still a work in progress, and it's a matter of you do the best you can, but actually take the time to put the effort in and reach out and get as many people together as you can, and put in the work. And yeah, there have been attempts in the past, but they didn't put in this level of work, and they also didn't try and ensure that they got 100% of everything right. So those are the two big distinctions between all three Arrow processes on the whole trilogy versus everything that's come before, because there have been so many, and none of them have gone to these lengths on all three.
Yeah, exactly. And the care, the care extends to, for example, interpreting sources. There is, for example, a scan of an IB Tech print that was used as a reference for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And one of my complaints with a lot of kind of, I think, other places that tend to restore films is that, and I suspect Richard Vada falls victim to this frequently, is separating out the nature of a flawed, the ravages, a flawed source because of the ravages of time, a flawed source because that's the way it was back then, or a flawed source because of transfer issues. Those three things. So, for example, the IB Tech scan of this print, sorry, the digital scan of this IB Tech print, so many words there, has issues, and those issues mostly have to do with the dynamic range of the scanner, I think, where skies are a bit more blown out than I think that they probably are in the print. They're not photochemically blown out, they're clipped. Shadows are sometimes crushed. Sometimes saturation might be a bit much or push in an interesting direction. And so that doesn't mean it's a bad, it's a terrific source for a reference, but that means one has to do essentially decryption of it. You have to interpret it.
Yeah.
And so much care was put into how to interpret that source. And there are so many rounds of checks, and the colors will move in one direction, and we'd go, this is great in these regards, but let's take into account the fact that, for example, skies are probably not quite so clipped in that specific way on the, if I were to project that print. And so let's, and because there's not an unlimited budget to, like, in a perfect world, you would have unlimited money thrown. You'd have some billionaire saying, hey, spend $500,000 scanning this print on the greatest 8K scanner in the world just so you can use it as a reference, right? So
Yeah.
it's never going to
be
happen.
Nice, but that doesn't happen.
Exactly. Or project that print and go through that whole stuff, which, again, that is absurdly expensive. And so one has to kind of triage, and part of that triage is going, okay, we're going to use this imperfect scan of a print as a reference, but we are going to interpret it the best we can using the vast knowledge available to the good folks at Arrow to interpret these things. And so... and so it's interesting because a lot of the time I see, one fad right now is, I'm sure you're very well familiar with this, is the kind of 35 mil bootleg print thing, right? Where people scan prints on, homebrew scanners.
And they can turn out a whole variety of different ways.
Yeah, who knew Jurassic Park was blue? And so,
Yeah.
And I, on one hand, think that's a terrific initiative, and that adds valuable data points. But that's all they are. They're data points. And so there's this kind of idea that, oh, wow, this version, just because it's a print by someone who seems like an enthusiastic, therefore it is the reference that we ought to use, and let's do a fan cut of the 4K HDR version and just match the color of that, that sort of thing, right? And so, but like anything, all these things need interpretation. And what I find is one of the toughest things to do is, I know I have seen 35 mil prints of many films, and a lot of the times I go, this 35 mil print is not accurate because it has been sitting in a basement. That is not the color of the film. That is the color of Vinegar Syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
The syndrome, not the company.
Yeah.
And so one must always take every single release ever with a grain of salt, and cross-reference other sources. Basically, engage in academic review on
Yeah.
all of these things if one wants to do it. And it's an interesting imperfect art / science mix.
That's true. And then you have to actually manage to get as many elements as you can, because I know you're well aware it's incredibly difficult to see a theatrical print screening of a Leone film, especially something that's an older print. And some of the films, it's, DCP only and has been that way for a long time. And those are flawed DCPs of flawed video master restorations and such. So just even being able to get some of these materials to even look at, or have a frame of reference, because that's really what they are. They're frames of reference. They give you a certain bit of insight, but you can't take them as de facto perfect references either. And unfortunately, some past releases of these films have used, at least in some ways, they have referred back to past video releases and done some work that, not to single any out, but I know on some of the Kino releases, well, really all three of them to a degree, did rely on some of the past MGM iterations in terms of looking at color and edits and stuff like that. And it's like, well, those have issues of their own. That's not a proper reference. Like, you can look at those,
Mm.
sure, and see what they are, but that's why there are some issues in the Kino releases on all three that you really wish weren't there, because they used things as references that themselves had issues that had been caused by other people not ironing out everything as they were making it, and sort of cobbling things together and calling it a day. And it's like, well, no, it's not what we need, guys.
Yeah, it's interesting too because there's this there's even if one references a good a best available source, those sources are often like even the best available source, the perfect print. And by perfect, I mean one that's been well preserved for X number of years. In the case of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, we're up to what, like 65 years now? No, 59 years. We're up to 59 years now. and there's no such thing as film that is fully stable throughout that period.
Yes. Have you seen that makes me think of a particular example. Have you ever seen MGM's print of For a Few Dollars More? The only one they have?
I've seen a very beat up print of For a Few Dollars More. Maybe that was the MGN one.
Did it have
I'm
a
not sure.
faded shot in it?
Well, I mean, half of it was Vinegar Syndrome to hell.
Oh.
So it might have just been like a local print from some collector.
Oh, okay. I was wondering, because when I saw it, it was it was deemed so rough that the theater had put taped a sign at the window that said, "This is the one print MGM has. It's in rough shape. If that bothers you, we'll just go ahead and refund your ticket money and go see something else." And I'm like, what? Because they had shown the 2007 Italian restoration of Fistful on a print, and I had just seen that because they were doing a mini festival. And that looks stunning on 35. And of course, I'm having to go off my memories, and that you always got to keep in mind this was years and years ago, so I don't sit there going, I remember exactly what every single shot was like. But I also try to take notes and stuff. But yeah, they had shown the 2007 Italian restoration of Fistful, and then For a Few Dollars More comes up, heavy wear. It's a 1967 US release edit print, so it's got the US edit cuts exactly. And I mean, it seemed pretty much identical to the letterbox Laserdisc, and I was like, what, did they just scan this print back then? But the only difference was it had one shot that had been, I think maybe it was just replaced with a faded source for maybe damage reasons or something, because suddenly one shot is completely pink It's during the prison breakout. It's when Indio sends his two goons down to basically be be human targets, and they go down the steps, and suddenly that shot's full pink, and I'm like, what? But then the rest of the film was no other issues like that. I believe it was dye transfer, but it had tons of wear, and then the soundtrack was kind of quiet for the first half, and then for the second half, it's like somebody flicked a switch and suddenly it was super loud.
Oh
Um,
God.
but the thing was, it was so visceral. It's still the best Leone screening experience I've ever had. So there's that too, because it was like, this is what it is. This is all we got. And but it just really underlined the need for trying to get stuff together and trying to have better preservation standards, because I don't know if that print has been screened much since then. It's pretty much just been nothing but DCPs of whatever the latest video master is that's full of issues. And I sincerely hope that somehow they work it out, and when MGM or whoever is doing, or Park Circus, when they do DCPs, that it's actually the new Arrow versions that are utilized, since they are 4K with HDR, and typically most DCPs are working from the same files that are used for or the completed video masters,
Yeah.
because I've seen
So
DCPs where it's literally just like, oh, this is the Blu-ray on the big screen. It's exactly the same. So
usually usually they're sourced from the same thing. What depending on the practices of the post house, like modern kind of practices to do your usually HDR grading first, but not always, and then you do trims using Dolby Vision trims for like various things. So you can do Dolby Vision trim for like P3, which is the cinema standard, and then Dolby Vision trim for Rec 79, the SDR standard, etc. The good studios monitor those trims and make sure they aesthetically match, because there's no way to get a mathematical match because of the way HDR works. But yeah, no, this is actually one that you brought up, something that I really wanted to touch upon, which is the frustrating nature of DCP distribution and how it relates to home video, because I personally am skeptical that the Arrow versions will see the light of day as DCPs. And that reason is that they were done independently by an outside home video studio, and they don't represent MGM's in-house work. And usually studios just stand out their in-house stuff. Like I've had, and even then, like after the 4K release of the Back to the Future films, which I think, for whatever problems, they are an upgrade over the old HD masters.
Oh yeah, by far.
Exactly. I saw Back to the Future it was a big screening with Dean Cundy in attendance. It was great. They used the old master that looked like garbage, right? Which is a real shame.
Thanks for pouring salt in the wound, guys.
Yeah, and so and then other times it's like, I saw that with Streets of Fire. I've seen that with so many things, and Streets of Fire especially makes sense because I believe that Shout's the only place you can find that version isn't it on Shout, or it might have just been an old outdated DCP, but this was years after Shout released their wonderful 4K. It looked like it was a clearly inferior version with like crushed blacks and like those old like 2K scanner artifacts and added digital noise, etc., etc. It was not a great looking version, and so my worry for these three films going forward is just that, as far as I know, the circulating DCPs are still the ones that I saw.
I've wondered about this because I've had the opportunity to go see the modern DCPs, and I was like, I don't want to do it. I can't sit through that. Plus, you got to pay repertory art house ticket pricing and do all that to then know you're going to sit through pain. That's why I didn't see the DCP of the latest restoration of Once Upon a Time in America, complete with intermission, because I was like, I already can't stand it on video with that awful color and the sound remix and shoving the extra scenes back in, whether they need to be there or not. And I'm like, I don't want to sit through that in the theater.
My advice for anyone listening to this who's like, how can I get good versions of movies in the repertory cinema? My best advice is build relationships with them to the point when you can advocate for certain showings. That's how we got The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly played at a certain local repertory cinema. The what we call the definitive version in 2019. Very, very over our own skis there, and so we've gotten repeatedly films screened in cinemas that represent better or more historically accurate versions because we just like take it upon ourselves to just grassroots it.
Yeah.
And so that can work. You don't even have to like rent the cinema. You can just, again, get to know people, build trust in your community. I feel like one of those like center left political organizers right now, but no, it's democracy starts in your hometown.
I'm the guy who would send emails going, "Hey, I saw you got a print listing. Do you know what year it was struck and what sound formats it had?" And so when they finally met me, they thought I was like some retired cinema professional in their 70s or 80s, and then I was like, yeah, I'm the guy who sent those emails about that print. They're like, we passed it around the office. How what we thought you were like retired or something. I'm like, no, it's just me. I'm that guy.
Yeah, it's one of those things where like I can't claim to have any training in film restoration or like particular skills to offer. My particular skills are in filmmaking, right? Like I am a colorist, cinematographer, et cetera, et cetera. But there is a place. What I found for myself is that there is a place for people who are willing to take the time to take it upon themselves to connect things.
Take
where
it apart, figure out, okay, well, if this is like this, how did it get like this? How does that associate with everything else that's around? It's just literally taking things apart until you can figure out just how it got to that point, and then you got to figure out what you can do with that.
and even connecting institutions where it's like we got 1 hour with you with the tinted copy of 1 hour with you played in reasonably good quality in a local cinema because I found out about it from a friend of mine who works at the Academy Library or the Margaret Herrick Library and took it upon myself to make my own cut of the Blu-ray with that version and then and then pitch it to a local cinema. And so that didn't take any special skills, right? That doesn't reflect well on my skills as a restorationist because I'm not. What it does mean though is that like if anyone listening to this, including you, Spencer, which you clearly already do a ton of, if you want to just take it upon yourselves, there's no better person than you just because you have the willingness to do it and maybe the knowledge to put two and two together.
Yeah, that's the thing. I've learned more about just film in general doing this stuff than I ever did in film school. I don't even think I still consider myself self-taught in a lot of ways because it's stuff I've always done. But I started doing this just because my favorite films were messed up, and then I would find out more, and then I would go, why is this like this? And so it started with James Bond and Star Wars and the Leone films. Those were the three, and it's just like, can we not get these to a point where they're not degraded or messed around with in some fashions? Like it can't be this hard.
It's so interesting how hard like the roadblocks are often these illusions to that and they're kind of self-imposed by institutions. And often just because like the nature of film is that everything is scattered to the wind before the digital era and actually after it, just in different ways. And I mean, like I'm currently embroiled in a very fascinating tale of finding out about a version of an Ernst Lubitsch silent film that was not widely known to exist. And I've only since, by digging a bunch, found out that some people knew something was different about this version, but not quite what. And so, I've been friendly emailing a bunch of guests of my former podcast, the Lubitsch one, and going back and forth and building up like a kind of a log of historical references for these two versions of this film, and it is in the process of attempting to find funding for a restoration, and that only happened because someone on my Discord server posted a link to the Bundesarchive going, wait a second, they uploaded this film that's only been available in potato quality. And then I took the time to look at it and realized something was up with it.
Yeah,
And so,
and that's how it starts. It's just stuff
yeah,
like that, and it's just like somebody finding a print element in a vault or a box or in under the ground, or all the silent film discoveries you read about, and it was, found under a parking lot, that just whatever. It's
yeah.
just stuff like that, and then you got to run it to ground. You got to figure out, okay, well, where is this from? What element really is this? What version is this? And it's that sort of film detective work or video detective work, depending on what you're doing. I've got something similar that's a new branching off point from some of the stuff I've been doing. There's rumors and indications there might be a lot of at least some magnetic stereo alternate mixes of some of the earlier Bond films, for the
Mm.
60s and 70s films. And there's also rumors some might have had 70 millimeter blowups, although that's unconfirmed. So I've tried to figure that stuff out for years. But On Her Majesty's Secret Service is at least somewhat confirmed due to reports and John Glenn's autobiography that it may have had at least a partial magnetic stereo mix for the premiere
Wonderful.
for certain reels. So I kind of knew about that. But then I stumbled onto another thing where I randomly found on a Japanese version, there's suddenly music tacked on the end like it's exit music, and it's a unique source of the film mix of We Have All the Time in the World, and it's complete, but the quality isn't that great. And I'm like, where did this come from? Because they just shoved it on, they tacked it onto the end of the US video master that was just, pressed in Japan and added subtitles. And I'm like, where did this come from? Does this mean they just took it from like maybe a Japanese print, and maybe the film had exit music in certain countries? Like, what? Because it had to come from somewhere. It's that version's not, in complete release anywhere as of yet, and the quality isn't that great, so they must have taken it from some lesser source, and there had to be a reason for them to do that, because otherwise I don't know why they would just throw music on the end of the film that they sourced from some element. So now I'm like, so did this movie have exit music at one point? Like, where did this come from? And of course, that film was edited multiple times to cut down the runtime because it was longer. So it took until the US MGM letterbox laserdisc, when they made that video master. That was the first uncut video release, and they didn't say anything. And I'm like, well, why wouldn't they put that on the jacket or something? But that's why all the older video copies are usually missing entire sequences, and it's significantly shorter and kind of choppy, because most of the prints of that film are choppy prints that were cut down.
Hmm. It's interesting. There's nothing more exciting than finding that a film has elements that you didn't know existed to me. Like that.
Yeah.
That's such a great story. Is there any other things with the Dollars films or restoration that we haven't touched upon yet?
I
That
guess maybe we should touch a little bit on some of the specifics for each film,
mm-hmm.
so that way people have at least some general idea that it wasn't just, oh, we worked on all three films at the same time and they all had the same problems, because each one is basically
Oh my god, yeah.
it's like you got to do the research project first, and then you got to get everything together, and you got to get all the entities talking with one another and saying, yes, you can do this, and okay, here's what we got. We didn't find anything else. And then you also got to keep the lines of communication open, because they may say that, but then 2 weeks later they may go, well, somebody found this in a different vault. We don't know what this iteration is or something. So yeah, each film was a lot of work in and of itself.
It was, and I mean, one interesting, even like little sobering side note is that Arrow's access to MGM's resources was curtailed at one point because of the LA fires, right?
Yeah.
LA, people might remember, was very on fire earlier this year, and it actually, I mean, this is a very minor side note to what's a huge tragedy. But it also meant that, unexpectedly, they all work for finding extra elements in the MGM vault had to stop.
And
So,
naturally, yeah, it's like
yeah,
such stuff happens in the real world, and then unfortunately it's like, well, Yeah, as you said, this is obviously a very small side effect of something that's enormous and affecting everyone. But it also means that obviously somebody can't go looking around the vaults at that particular time.
Yeah, and so to kind of like go into each of the films too. I mean, the so Fistful was. I mean, I think The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was the most work intensive one. Fistful, I think the video came together quite well and relatively easily. But
Yeah,
the
it seems like it.
yeah, there wasn't there wasn't a ton of kind of back and forth about the different cuts. Like, luckily with that film, the cut references uh, are pretty easy. The audio, on the other hand, as mentioned, is this combination of, I believe, three sources from opening titles, which were missing from every version that MGM sent over.
Which is
Uh,
scary.
it is sourced from your Laserdisc, and then the various the audio for the rest of the film was sourced from an incomplete but very high quality censored version, and a lower quality uncensored version for those patches. This is where we can talk about the optical. I'm gonna get the acronyms right. What era was sent by MGM and what MGM and Richard Vada tend to send to everyone, which is the optical soundtrack negative and positive, or the OSTN and OSTP. These are transfers from the optical tracks on film, and those should theoretically represent a high quality and raw transfer of those materials. But what was found was that, depending on the film, these materials were in wildly different states. I can't say whether it was due to the ravages of time or due to, again, these were mid 60s genre films, right? They weren't subject to the highest quality standards that Hollywood could do.
Plus, they were dubbed, so you got that generational loss baked in.
Yep. Tons of that. And so for example, the OSTN and OSTP, which usually sounded pretty similar, they had a lot of the similar artifacts, but sometimes had new ones. It was an interesting comparison because I listened to all those sources, and then those would be compared to the various other sources. So for example, on The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, it was after lots and lots of discussion and comparison, just decided that, hey, there's two choices. You can polish the OSTN or P, I forget which it was, a ton, and kind of get it increasingly close to what it was with the Laserdisc, or just use the Laserdisc and polish that a little, but basically render it mostly untouched. And the thing I found interesting about that film, actually, with the audio, was that the Laserdisc had detail that the OSTN and OSTP didn't, and this is still an ongoing mystery of where the hell was the Laserdisc transferred from, because it doesn't sound like a remix, but it does sound like it's from almost like an earlier generation source, or maybe again, ravages of time. This transfer was as old as me. Digital transfer is as old as me. So maybe the OSTN and OSTN sources had just not aged as badly. But it's such an interesting mystery.
That's one of the LD audio situations I've tried to figure out. I have so many of those mysteries where there's some amazingly good track or mix that's unique, and I don't know where it came from. I don't know who transferred it. I don't know if it's perhaps somehow some sort of remix done at the time, or from whatever element it was. And I wish there was some documentation somewhere. I've even wondered if the GBULD, because that first pressing was 1990, when they were doing their catalog refresh of a lot of titles for the first time and doing a lot of the initial widescreen masters. I've wondered if maybe perhaps they somehow had like a print master source and used that with the mixing of the Italian print footage, which obviously they thought was better quality than what they had of the English version for those sections. So we already know they were mixing and matching elements, because those
Mm-hmm.
Italian bits come up, and then one or two of the edits are a little bit weird and not exactly what was in the international cut in the original release. So it's anybody's guess, but like you were saying, it becomes a matter of, well, we now have the original audio source, but it's got so many issues that if we spend all this extra time and money that we don't really have in the budget necessarily, uh, we might be able to get it as good as the laser disc. We might not, but we might be able to get it close to this. But we already have this laserdisc audio source that is already so significantly better in these areas that it kind of becomes a point of, well, why wouldn't you just stick with that, make that as good as it can be? Because the other, you've got to spend all this extra effort, which you again don't really have the ability to do so, and you don't know if you're going to be able to get to 100% of the level of the other. So I totally understand why they went with that choice. And while it's unfortunate that a lot of the original elements don't have the greatest fidelity or are limited due to the wears of age and time, or how they were recorded, and and then of course they were dub tracks. There's all this stuff baked in, so you got to look at each one on a case by case basis.
Yeah, and it's one of those fun things where you know it, the the it's one of those things too where the quality of the source from what you would think of as the highest quality source, not being what one would expect. In this case, the OST and OSTP. Um, Raises so many interesting questions of, is there like a mag track source that is just lying in a vault somewhere? Were those lost? I
Yeah.
kind of think that maybe the Laserdisc was made from like an earlier generation than even what's on the OST and OSTP source, and then that earlier generation source is either just sitting in a vault somewhere or has been since lost. So I don't. Yeah, it's interesting.
I think it was something that was either lost or deteriorated. That would be my guess. Um, I just wish that, like I said, I wish there was some sort of documentation that maybe was in the MGM vault alongside the old D1 video master tapes for Laserdisc. Like, I'm like, if I could get in that room, if that existed anywhere, because there's so many. Like I said, there's so many audio mysteries where I'm like, why does this sound so much better? Where did this come from? Like, why can't somebody use this again? Like, one of the big ones. It's like, what is the source of this exclusive Matrix surround track for Raiders of the Lost Ark on the Letterbox Laserdisc? This sounds better than every other version I've ever heard, and it seems to be an original mix of some type. It's got more punch to it than any other version. It's got more surround imaging, but there's no remixing or added effects. One sound effect is different. So I'm like, is this one of the random Lucasfilm variants? Because Raiders has multiple mixes. It had a custom mono track with differences too that they don't release. So I'm like, what is the source of this thing? Why can't I find out what the heck this thing is, and why does everything else sound nowhere near as good as this thing?
Yeah, uh, it's the ins and outs of film history raise so many mysteries. We could,
Yeah.
one could spend a whole lifetime on this. I mean, that's what the professionals do. They literally spend lifetimes on this. So kudos to them. The video elements are also interesting because this is where we can talk about the way in which that that kind of these restored the order of operations of restoration and how they're archived, because you tend to have things archived at three states. You have the first state, which is just the scan, nothing done to it. Second state, which is the log restored versions, which basically they've been things like stabilized, cleaned up, conformed, and then have not had any color, the aesthetic parts of color done to them, and they're in log state, which is logarithmic color, which I did a video on this that I can point people to on my YouTube channel. But then the third state is the graded version, and so to create these, a mix of the negative scans and the log restored versions, which were prioritized when possible, were used. The reason why they weren't always used was because because of the nature of digital technology, some of the log restored stuff was not available anymore. It had been lost. Probably an LTO machine failure or something, and which is very sobering when you think of the digital era. People think
Yeah,
of cloud
it's
memes
such a
forever.
major problem because digital archiving is not at that preservation level, and people just don't think about it until they run into it. And you're
Yeah.
stuck just having to constantly buy new drives and copy everything over. And hope it works, and then keep just cycling through that every so often, and hope nothing goes wrong.
Exactly. So we have these, and so these films are an interesting mix, or these releases are an interesting mix of the two earlier states. And again, you don't use the graded versions because you might not agree with the color grade. If the color grade were perfect, you'd use those because it's cheaper. But if you don't agree
Yeah.
with Rich Ravada's color grading decisions, you don't use those.
No.
And so, yeah, you have that interesting mix, and all three films were almost entirely sourced from those. There's also other, minor picture sources from other sources, but the vast bulk of the films are just from those MGM/Rich Ravada restorations from the mid 2010s, and so you get a very, like, by the mid 2010s you'd gotten 4K scanners were in a pretty good place. They're not perfect. I mean, I've seen like images of like some grain funkiness
Yeah,
happening.
there's a couple quirks that poke through. They're very, very fleeting, but like I'm watching through Fistful, and there's like maybe, I think it's like three or four I saw, and it's only, I mean, admittedly it's only going to be people like us who have seen these films a million
Mm-hmm.
times and have tried to work on them ourselves and know all the ins and outs of the various transfer processes and things. But yeah, there's like three maybe where it's just like, it's just in the background of the sky of one shot you can see a
Yeah.
little, just like a flash of sort of grain funkiness going on, and then it's like, well, let me go back, and then you go and look at others that have used the same scan, and it's there. It just might not be
Usually
as
there.
visible because this is so much more resolved in terms of going back to the more original elements of the scan itself, and the encoding is so much better. Plus, you've got HDR now, so it might make some of the inherent quirks of the scan itself at times just a little bit more visible. But they're in Fistful, those are extraordinarily fleeting. But I had to go back to the others and go like, wait, this was this always there? Okay, yeah, that was that thing I saw, but it's now just more visible because everything else is so much better.
Yeah, exactly. So you have those things that carry over, and I could not tell you where in the signal chain those were introduced, except that they were
Right.
there in the negative scan. It's an interesting question of when things are scanned, because you have these kind of dual forces, right? Where obviously rescanning the negatives is not in the budget for a project like this, but even if you could, oftentimes negatives have deteriorated in the 10 years since
Yeah.
the last scan. And so you have we're in an interesting time where scanning technology continues to improve, but the negatives in our pre-DI world continue to deteriorate. So it's almost a race against time we're in,
Yeah, it really is.
constantly.
Yeah, and then it's like, okay, if you did a new scan of something, how much would it actually upgrade the scan that you already have? Is it going to be, I mean, in a perfect world, you'd be able to just scan everything and start from scratch, or do any extra work you might need and say, oh, we're going to scan this print in 16K just because we can. And we don't have to worry about a budget or whatever. But, in the case of these or anything else, if you already have a high resolution scan that is extremely good, it may not be 100% perfect, but the cost to perhaps be able to address that like last
Mm.
5% that maybe you could do better with a brand new scan, is it going to justify the manpower and the cost it's going to take? And would you even be able to do better because the element obviously is now older? Is it even going to stand up to another scan? You've got to worry about that too.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all these considerations, and you have to basically pick the sort of best option.
One element to the restorations of these films that I want to flag for people, because I'm very curious if anyone can come up with more instances of this, is I've started noticing something in a lot of the way that, because film is obviously, it weaves, it's called Gateweave. And so, this is another example of the kind of questions of film restoration. So, get this. I started noticing in the Vinegar Syndrome release of Hookers on Davy, which is a terrific Vancouver film, documentary about the local sex worker culture in around the 80s. That terrific. Point being, though, the Vinegar Syndrome has an issue. That issue is that the 4K restoration of that film uses a very common technology in film restorations. It's ubiquitous, where you stabilize the frame, right? Because film shakes a lot, especially when it's been warped through the years. You need to stabilize it. However, the stabilizers often track to the heads of the subjects and not the frame itself. And so when someone moves the camera in like that weird MacBook camera way, I don't know what they call it, but where the camera follows your head, it does that in the version. And I was like, this can't be original. There's no way the camera operator was like had some sort of laser focus on the subject's nose. So I went back to the previous version, non-existent at all. Didn't, it looked fine. And I have started noticing this in releases, and I wonder if this isn't another thing where people are going to start noticing it, because I think it exists in some shots in the good, the bad, and the ugly in the 4K scan that's out there.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I haven't seen the GBU UHD yet, but on For a Few Dollars More, there's a couple sequences where I almost wonder if it's just an inherent problem in the element at times, because it's almost like there's a very light, almost, I mean, I hate to say vibration, but it's like there are certain sequences where there's just a little bit of movement, but it's so slight that it's almost kind of not fully quivering, but now that we're looking at this stuff in 4K resolution, and especially with HDR and great encodes and things, it's going to show any issue that was there. It's going to make hairs in the gate more obvious, and all the things that are just part of the film. But on For a Few Dollars More seems to have more than its fair share of element issues in picture and sound. So it's like Fistful was seemingly, outside of having to work more on the audio, that was, I guess it's probably it was the easiest process of the three. It had the least number of element quirks to deal with compared to the other two. But yeah, on For a Few Dollars More, on the everything that's used, the Richard Vada scan, I've felt like there were some moments that had just a little like inherent movement. So I don't know if that's
Yeah.
just from scanning the negative and being used to seeing other versions that were many generations away, or if it's just something that's part of that scan. So that's something I'm going to be digging more into. But I've noticed what you're talking about once or twice, where it seems like the tracking of movement is now getting to such a point where it's going to try to actually focus on specific moments, and that's going to interfere with the actual original composition or the original camera movement itself, and
It can
that's
be
going to
very
be a
difficult
problem.
for the algorithm to know what's the frame moving and what's the. Imagine you have an extreme close up and someone is like, someone has like their hand in the frame doing that, and there's no frame of reference for stillness, right?
Mm-hmm.
That means that the algorithm can't tell, like, what's it going to do, right? Handheld movies are quite difficult for this in terms of stabilizing out the shaking of the film without stabilizing out the handheld, right?
Yeah, it's like
Um,
which is which.
and so, there's, I think, the screamingly obvious issue with that Vinegar Syndrome release of Hookers on Davy, which is otherwise a beautiful release, has kind of awakened me to it in other films. And I'm very curious to see if people can find other moments when it's like, oh, that actor's head moved, and why would the tripod operator follow them an inch?
Sounds like me and seeing frozen grain everywhere.
Yes, exactly. Once I
Once you
started,
see it, you can't unsee it. Oh man,
that was a real like UHD thing, where as soon as UHD starts coming out and the fidelity of the grain, you could start seeing it everywhere. It was visible before, but it's like,
yeah, before, and in most cases it's sporadic, or it's one shot, or it's portions of something. And I guess I'm predisposed to it more because I've been watching laserdiscs for so long. I got used to seeing ringing, which is a laserdisc thing. Specifically, a lot of
yes.
players will add that, and especially that combined with early edge enhancement. When I was first watching the Dollars Trilogy laserdisc, I had to get used to that real quick. So
Mm.
every landscape shot, and there's Clint Eastwood there in full costume, and he's got a gigantic ring around himself, almost like a halo at points. And I'm like, well, this is a unique phenomenon. Here we go. And then I eventually had to get a player that didn't have ringing issues, and that took care of that, and that was amazing. But then you still had to deal with the edge enhancement and the transfer anyway, because there's always some quirk or problem.
Yeah, no, it's every generation brings its own new issues, and strangely, I mean, I'm so happy we're not in the time when like I had to be happy to get that Criterion Paris Texas in 2007 or whatever, or 2008, that had edge enhancement out the wazoo. Every I think there's this kind of almost anti, what's the best way to put this? There's almost a kind of a sense that every time we kind of the new generation of transfers takes hold, that somehow the previous ones were better in some way. And what I found is that like the goalposts just move. The new tools both allow greater fidelity and also greater new avenues for misuse.
Yeah.
And so we're in this constant like game of like new tools open up things and stabilization. Like, I mean, think about HDR and what's happening with that right now, right? It's there's the kind of two philosophies for HDR, right? There's the just treat it as a bigger container. You don't got to use it. You just have to match what the film is. Or the Paramount, let's, wow, we have all this space. Let's get the sky at 800 nits at all times. It's
and then the Sony light cannon at the extreme. Those early masters they did, where it's like, where are my sunglasses?
Like, and some of those, I mean, and so I think we're still in that place with HDR where a lot of HDR releases are just, I think, almost inferior to their SDR counterparts, just because the more limited nature of SDR isn't better. There's no such thing as the HDR look. The Steve Yedlin video that was just released on HDR is great, but there's no such thing as like an imposed aesthetic for HDR. You can just put something in an HDR container that looks aesthetically identical to an SDR. There's no difference. The thing about HDR is it allows you to, instead of going from 0 to 100, it allows you to go from 0 to 1,000, or however high you want to go. It's functionally unlimited.
Yeah, that's my thoughts with HDR on catalog titles. I'm like, okay, if you're going to use HDR, just place it in there. It's a bigger container to allow the image to breathe a little bit more. It might not be that much, but that way you're not potentially messing around with something, because I've seen even some very tasteful HDR presentations of catalog titles, and then you switch over to the SDR version, especially of that same master, like if they include a Blu-ray disc, and it's suddenly like, oh my God, this is so much better.
Mm-hmm.
It's especially black and white films, most of all. Those are the ones where it really just, if there's a little too much somewhere, it is like a beacon. And there have unfortunately been some that are just, the one that kills me is the Warner Maltese Falcon UHD.
I knew you were going to bring that up. It's what if we shot the Maltese Falcon on the surface of the sun?
Oh, and it's not as bad as it could be, of course, but still, I'm just like, this is one of the most intricately composed films that I've studied my entire life, and I think the photography of this film should be used in classrooms at all times, because Arthur Edison was brilliant, and the whole film is a visual tour de force using what they had, and that UHD just, it starts to tear it apart. And then of course the audio is over processed, and it's just like, no, can we get a redo, guys? This is just no.
It's a shame, because otherwise that transfer is beautiful. Like, it is
That's
such
the
a
thing.
gorgeously
MPI did
high fidelity,
really great job overcoming past damage, and it's not like they have the most pristine stuff to work with. And on the flip side, they did a much better job on Casablanca. It's not perfect. I do have some quibbles with the HDR in some spots there, and unfortunately, it does actually highlight some of the element issues in the conclusion, which is, I mean, those are just baked in there, but the HDR actually kind of puts a spotlight on those.
Yeah.
But overall, it's much better, because I think they paid a lot more attention, because it's Casablanca, but still, they kind of cut some corners, and Warner doesn't like Dolby Vision, and they also overprocess the mono like crazy, but that film has always had overprocessed monos. It's like, well, I don't see Arrow or anybody getting those films anytime soon, but it would be nice if a lot of the studios and other entities could take a page out of Arrow and other people's book and say, hey, maybe we should put some more effort into this stuff so it actually comes out as good as we can make it.
Yeah, it's it's a constant fight between. I mean, I kind of equate HDR to the 5.1 craze of
Yes.
remixes, where it's, hey, we got 5 channels, we better use them. Let's put off-screen dialogue in the back. Oh wow, this mono track, it's all bunched in. Let's just remix the whole thing. Let's do it from scratch. And then
Yeah.
you move down that rabbit hole, and it's just, you know what? A great 5.1 mix is the thing Blake did on the Kino Good to Bad and the Ugly, which is that he just like did some LFE crossover.
Yeah,
And
it's
that's
little tiny adjustments. And Arrow, yeah, I've been really impressed with what they did on the 5.1s of the first two films. Of it's clearly coming from the same restoration work and the same the mono track that they've put together, and tastefully bringing that into the 5.1 container. It stays pretty much center locked with
mm-hmm.
some general spread into the left and right mains for the music, but without overpowering things. Just a little bit of LFE for those particular moments, a very tasteful amount, and there's little to nothing in the surrounds, which is how it should be to preserve that front stage image. So it's a very tasteful expansion. So that way, the people who insist on having to have multi-channel no matter what are still going to get the sound, filling their space out more,
Yeah.
but also not lose the original intent of the sound design, because that's something that happens all the time, even when they don't change sound effects. That's always killed me on the Once Upon a Time in the West remix, because yes, they didn't really add a ton of new effects or anything, but they changed the sound emphasis of every single scene. The
Mm-hmm.
music levels, the sound effect levels, and now that it's spread out, it's a totally different experience. It's not as good as the original mono, and you can't even get the original mono untouched on those versions. And it's like, this is a problem, guys. Just because people have gone out and bought multi-channel setups doesn't mean that you have to force that onto everything. It's like, if you've got to do it, at least take the time to do something tasteful that doesn't mess around with the sound design, but also give people both, because even on these Arrow releases, as tasteful as those 5.1s are, they're not as good as the original mono mixes, because the sound is being spread out more. It's having to do all this stuff just to take the single channel mono mix and bring it into a 5.1 environment, and it's having to do stuff that, no matter what, takes it away from that original single channel impact. And it does make a difference. Even if you're just toggling back and forth, there is a difference in impact.
Yeah, it's one of those things where if one is obliged to do that as an option, there are good ways to do it.
Yeah.
At least less bad.
Yeah, less
and
bad.
yeah, and it gets back to that thing that we always return to for good reason. We both sound like broken records on this, but that's for good reason. Things are very easy to forgive when you include an option for the original. Mm-hmm. And that's where DCPs have their issues, right? Where it's like, I'm not going to ask a local cinema to play American Graffiti anytime soon, because I know it's likely going to be the new version now.
Yeah, you don't want to see that on the big screen.
No, it would break my heart. There's not much that gets me to walk out of a cinema, but if I saw that power window on the diner, they show up, I'm leaving.
My local theater showed that DCP, and it was so bad that the manager who I was friendly with actually took a picture of the screen and just sent it to me saying, "What the hell is going on?" Like, we thought we thought our equipment was broken. We thought our projector had gone bad that we had installed, and I'm like, no, it's not your gear. It's that bad. And yeah, that is the new 4K version. And also pay attention to what they did to the sound, because they tore that apart too.
I hope you like Foley. I hope you like Foley everywhere.
Yeah.
That's the most I've been heartbroken over a restoration in a very long time.
Yeah, that was like, it's like, man, you're pushing all my Raiders of the Lost Ark buttons here in terms of all the stuff they've done to that over and over.
Because at least, I really wish that the 4K 77 folks should move on to American Graffiti, in my opinion, and get.
They're going to have to. That and THX are stuck in no man's land.
Yeah, it is interesting how you have that kind of there's almost like this is something I'm off the cuff, so this might be a terrible thought, but there's almost like an uncanny valley to the availability of good restorations for things, where if you're far enough in the obscure end, you get picked up by boutique labels because you're not going to get released elsewhere, and you can often get very well treated.
Mm-hmm.
Or a prominent restorationist like Kevin Brownlow takes the film under his wing and does great things with it. And then if you're a big pop culture staple, if the studios screw it up, you have people willing to do what Jordan and Benji do, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and et cetera, and make bootleg fan versions that are good, or at least superior.
As good as you can make them, because it's like you
exactly.
can't live with the status anymore.
Like that's why 4K 77 I think is just such a terrific project, because it's the only way I watch Star Wars now.
Yeah, and it's built off of years and years and years and years of fan collaborations. And I think one of of course, getting all the audio mixes together is unbelievably important, even if some are just fan recreations or doing the best they can. And then just the whole Project 3PO of getting all the subtitles
yes,
for everybody to actually have something in their own language, in addition to trying to gather together all the foreign dubs and trying to get the theatrical foreign dubs, so people, it's like that's a whole part of preservation that typically doesn't get gone into by a lot of people, and that's hugely important because who else is going to do that?
and then you got the whole middle though, which is the films that are big enough to get released by studios, but not big enough that you're going to have a fan backlash. So that's where you get, that's where you get stuff like American Graffiti. That's where you get stuff like, there's so many. I'm having a decision paralysis, but I think North by Northwest fits, where the new version of that I have increasing problems with.
Increase, yeah, good. Let's go ahead and put it. Increasing problems. Yeah, that was my increasing frustration level sitting through it, going, you spent how much? And then of course the searchers too, and you see
Yeah.
everybody bowled over on both of those by the resolution increase and the new scan, which again, like Maltese Falcon, great work by MPI on the front end. It's
Mm-hmm.
however this stuff gets taken from there, that like we were talking about before, you've got the scan itself and the first work stage, and then it's like at some point this gets all screwy somewhere, whether it's people making certain choices because they think that's the preference is, or it just gets goofed up somehow. It's like it could be a variety of different things, but it's not like they're going to tell us this stuff. But then
Yeah.
when you notice things and you try to figure out what to do or how to express it, it doesn't help that then typically you're just referred to as another crazy person on the internet. So there's that too.
It's
It's like,
very
what do you
frustrating.
do
Yeah.
with this?
This is part of why I respect your work so much, because the landscape for actual rigorous criticism of home video releases is, I think we can both agree, apocalyptic. It's barren as the Sahara Desert, and I'm probably misrepresenting the Sahara. There's a lot of beautiful places in the Sahara Desert, but the most barren 10% of the Sahara Desert, that's still less barren than the home video review landscape. And what I find is that, there's a whole cottage industry of people reviewing these things before they come out, clearly having not seen them. The fact that exists tells you all you need to know. It's given that I'm not part of that scene, I can probably go a bit further than you in like throwing fire, I guess. But my God, it is just the number of quote unquote big name as you can have in the Blu-ray.com space.
Yeah.
Number of reviewers who clearly don't know the first thing about film preservation and the way in which you translate things to the screen. I think that if one wants to write about this, learn what the words image formation mean, right?
Yeah, or just put some basic research work in, and also watch the entire disc, make comparisons, do a little digging, something. I know the whole sort of, and it's not like there's a rule book or a class you can take or any sort of rules for, who can do these things. And also, there's no rules for who gets studio or label support or how you even get review copies, because I don't get anything. I just, and then I've been waiting 19 years for this, and my Connery UHD set just arrived in the mail as we started recording, and I had to wait for this to get here. I had to wait to save up money and afford it, of course. But, I've been waiting almost 20 years to get away from the Lowry Masters we first got in 2006. That really are the single thing that put me on this self-titled crusade
Mm.
more than anything. It's what cemented everything, and then I've been digging and railing against them ever since. So I never thought we would see a full complete upgrade, but this is I don't know how much analysis work I'm going to be doing, but it's nonstop like I do with everything, and then putting everything together, and by the time you finally do, you have a super long video and you're well past the release date because you had to wait to get it and afford it and go through it and do everything and try to be as concise and well researched as possible, even when you're just kind of making shots in the dark a lot of the time. And then when you find stuff, you got to say something about it. No release is perfect. I didn't expect the Arrow releases to be perfect, but I know the work and effort that went in, and they've made them as well as they possibly can. And that's what I would like to see from every release. Just put in the work, guys. Don't cut corners here and there, or say such and such is fine. If it takes a little longer, it takes a little longer. It's not rocket science.
Exactly, and I think I mean, if I'm an advocate for one thing in life, it's for people being a little bit more intellectually curious
Yes, that's a perfect phrase.
about everything in life. But I think because I'm interested in video, video is a perfectly good hobby horse for that. If there's always a reason behind the way things work and look and sound, and those things are, I can tell you, and you can tell them from experience. We can both tell the audience from experience. Are usually not the first things you think of. It's if you've ever seen the Errol Morris short documentary, The Umbrella Man, I think that's a good parable for this, where the things that guide history are often completely chaotic and random, and
Yeah.
things that the mind could never think up in a million years. And if you think, you being the audience, if you in the audience think that why a certain film looks a certain way, the majority of the time I am wrong when I guess those things. And I like to think that I spend a lot of time around people who know more than me, and I am extremely wrong. And so we should all be okay with having our first thoughts and instincts be wrong, and to open up ourselves to the narrative being challenged in that way. And so that's one of the lessons I've had in humility over the years, I think, was where I would usually go, oh, that's why this is this way. And if I have a complaint about Blu-ray reviewers of various sorts, home video reviewers, it's that they don't follow up on those thoughts. And I wish more would. And part of why, Spencer, I was so excited and giddy to talk about this with you is that I think you're one of the very few in this space who follows up and does the homework that I would hope more people would do, and arrives at conclusions that I think are logical and sound in their research and framework. And so that's about the highest praise I can give.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear, because I'm driving myself nuts with everything, and then I'm like, is this gonna make any sense? I'm gonna get all the "you're too negative" and "you don't like anything" comments again, and all that feedback, and I'm like, well, I gotta point stuff out. And it's like I'm at the point where I don't claim to know everything, but I'm kind of at the point where I'm like, well, if I don't talk about this, who will? It's like I started doing reviews because I couldn't find reviews that covered the stuff I was trying to find out, and I'm like, well, I guess I can do some of those, and that was another rabbit hole I'm still going down.
Well, I hope you continue to go down the rabbit hole, because it's been incredibly helpful so far. um, are there any other things that we haven't touched upon that we ought to?
Um, I'm trying to think. I think we generally covered most everything.
Yeah, we got over all the notes I really wanted to get to, which is great. I didn't think we could.
Yeah, I was about to say, because I think we managed to sort of touch on points of all three, and the what sources they're using, and then all the people who think these are just basic video upgrades, well, if they listen to this, at least they'll have a bit more of a background. That's what I was hoping for, because I don't know if you've seen a lot of the reviews so far, but they have there have been some solid ones, and you can always tell when it's people who are trying but really don't have the background, and then all the others, some have said they're not as good as the Kinos, and I'm like, oh my, oh dear. How,
The interesting flip side to like a lot of people in this space overrating bad releases is that a lot of people also do not, shockingly, know a good release when they see one. And I'll say that
yeah.
as someone who has been mostly just fighting in this space for a few films that are my pet projects to be released properly, this is the best case scenario I can think of for one. I have no financial interest in this project, but I can say that. So I feel like I can shamelessly say it is worth getting if you are able to, even if it's a standard edition coming eventually, as opposed to limited editions. You don't need that poster. But the film itself is the object, and these are some of the. I'll put it this way. These are releases that I didn't think were in the realm of possibility 5 years ago. I did not think that this was going to happen, or this is any chance. I had resigned myself to it. And the fact that, sometimes in life good things happen in our fallen world. This is one of those. And I say this mostly not as someone who is involved. And again, I want to stipulate that my involvement was purely advisory. I was not a central player in this. I was giving my 2 cents when appropriate. And so I can say that there's no single decision on these releases that diverges from what I would have wanted on these releases, and that is, I can't believe I'm saying that. It's crazy.
Yeah, this is. I never thought these would happen. I thought maybe we might see another label get to take a crack at it, but it would just be, maybe a few minor upgrades that they might be allowed to do with the masters that exist. And if there ever was any sort of new scan work, it was going to be so far in the future that we wouldn't even know if there was ever even new scan work. And then the big thing of getting all parties involved to agree and say, yeah, okay, we'll allow that, even if there was some back and forth towards the tail end, and they weren't able to include the Italian audio on the other two, and that's not their fault. It's just, one of the rights holders changed their mind and said, we don't want to do that. And then Arrow's got to backtrack and say, okay, well then we can do this, and we can still at least have the intermission on for a few dollars more as a separate supplement. So there's always give and take, but I didn't expect us to get something like this where somebody was allowed to go in there and do the work and then actually try to get everything right and reach out to people. And my involvement was so tiny, even compared to yours, because I was just on the outside fringes. And I mean, really the only reason I was able to sort of stick my foot in the door is I've had some nice social media conversations with James Flower of Arrow, primarily because somehow they noticed my review of the Bruce Lee box set, and somebody was like, hey James, you ought to see this, it's like almost 4 hours long. Like, yeah, you guys did a good job. So I had to talk about it a lot. But yeah, when they first did like a teaser post, it was before they did anything, but there was some sort of Arrow post that sort of alluded to something, and I'm sitting there going, okay, is that Fistful of Dollars? Okay, even if it's not, you know what? I We've chatted on social media. I'll send him a private message. Just say, hey, if this really is a thing, if I can help in any way, just let me know. I can send you all my audio captures. I got a lot of those. And graciously, he actually responded, which I was like, oh my gosh. So that's really how I got my foot in the door, because I'm like, if I can help in any way, it'll at least make me feel like doing this since 2002 when I first saw GBU. And I don't know if it was 2002 or 2003, but it was right around the time they were starting to roll out the 2003 version, because I first saw it was the 1998 version, and it was on cable. So that was my first experience of getting into this world. So technically, I've been doing this since 2003 in various capacities of getting releases and trying to figure out stuff and going to theatrical screenings and talking with other fans and getting in forums. And it's also funny because now I'm been able to actually talk to some of the people I've been chatting with online and in fan groups face to face. So it's really lovely to actually be able to speak with you face to face for the first time.
Yeah. Well, if you're, if you're ever in Vancouver, let me know, and I'll get you the drink I owe you.
Okay.
But yeah, no, it's, and again, thank you so much for having me on this. It's, this is like, being on the talk show that I always watch. uh,
The talk
but,
show I wish existed. Yeah, make my own. It's wonderful to have you on. I really was happy you were coming on, because I just wanted to do something extra, because I wanted to hammer home, if I wasn't doing it already enough in my admittedly review videos that are going to be super long. I wanted to do something extra just to get some of the background of what went into these from somebody who had some more insight into the overall process than I did, because I saw little bits of things and looked at a few samples and got some of a view into that. But you had much more than I did, so I was like, you are the perfect person to go into this stuff a little bit more. So hopefully we can get people a little bit more aware of just how important these releases are, because I mean, you can now replace practically every older video edition you have on your shelf. I mean, I'm still going to hang on to them because I unfortunately have nostalgia for all my
yeah, I'm keeping my
video
laser disc.
editions.
I'm keeping that laser disc till the end of time.
Oh yeah, I've got to hang on to the pan and scan LD, because that has that raw audio track, and for the titles, that's the source. So I gotta
Mhm.
put that in a lockbox or something, along with the tape for a few dollars more and the GBU LD. So definitely those, but I've got nostalgia for all the screwy other editions, and all the stories associated with getting them. And unfortunately, we still got to worry about the other films, because
Yeah.
they're not in for the same treatment, unfortunately. I just hope MGM says, wow, you guys did a great job. You want to go mess around with the most cursed one, because I'm just like,
Colossus of Rhodes. Hell yeah.
that's the only one that's got a halfway decent version, but it's only the American cut.
Uh,
I was looking at the Italian version, and that's got some
uh,
crazy color on it. But no, I'm just like, can we please do DocuSucker,
yes, that would be
please?
amazing.
That's the one. I've been wanting, if I could just find out more information about the theatrical edits and edit history of specifically when they were done. I've been wanting to actually make a documentary just on the problems of that film, because it's, if people think the Leone films are cursed, DocuSucker is the most cursed, because it's like, people ask me, oh, what version do I get? I'm like, here's the list. Like, get the Eureka Blu-ray, but they did the best they could, but man, that's got tons of problems of its own. I watched the MGM 1996 Laserdisc, and then at the very end, during the flashback, I have to stop it and switch to a different version to get the full flashback with the correct music, and then the movie's over. So that's how I watch DocuSucker when I just want to enjoy the film. Not a recommended viewing option, but that's what I
Mm.
have to do.
I'm right now. I'm hung up on two films, both from 1927, actually. Napoleon, by Abel Gance, which I don't know if you know about the controversy around the Cinémathèque Française restoration, but that's its own story. That we could do a podcast that's
Yeah.
longer than the movie on that. And the other one is Ernst Lubitsch's, who, for those of you who are familiar with my podcast, is my favorite director ever. The Student Prince in Old Heidelberg, where that's the one where I stumbled upon a different version, and things are in motion, hopefully, to maybe restore a version of it.
Fingers
because
crossed.
it's available in a terrible Laserdisc rip right now with a great Carl Davis score. But I've done my own fan cut version of that with speculative tinting, with the HD master sync to the Carl Davis score, because that's what I do with my time. And so those are my two, like, kind of the ones I'm watching right now, because I'm trying to conform Napoleon, the Cinémathèque Française, to the photoplay restoration, and the problem with that is that they are different frame rates, and they're both encoded in 24 FPS containers. And actually doing the math on that has taken a long time.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, but the struggle goes on. We've gotten some big victories, but I keep seem to find movies that I like, which is a real problem in my life. And so as I keep finding movies I like, I keep finding ways to be annoyed at their restorations.
Such is video life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before I go, I was about to say before a recording turns into a pumpkin. Before I go,
Yeah.
I will shamelessly say to the listeners that if anyone here likes what I say, I do have a YouTube channel that's just my name, and I also have a Letterboxd account where I just a lot of my posts are formal analysis or otherwise restoration note analysis. So if you're interested in me hearing, like, journaling my restoration process of the student prints in Alt Heidelberg, that popular film from 1927 that no one has seen, that's where you can find that.
That's everything you're saying. I'm like, I feel like I've said things exactly like that many times. I'm just getting deja vu over here.
Yeah, no kidding. It's it's a life. I don't know. It's one of those things in life where I find that I do things in life to pay the bills, and sometimes those things happen to align with things that I find fulfilling. But the restoration and film preservation world is something where I do not expect I'll ever do anything more than not even turn a profit, but incur tremendous losses. And
yes.
Yet it is one of the my favorite things I am involved in. So thank you so much for doing so much actually in the past few years to help that journey along.
Oh, I'm glad to do so. Although I hope I haven't hurt your wallet too much.
Oh, not you personally. No, my own proclivities for getting multiple copies of films and paying people to edit things
and running out of space and having everyone turn you into a never-ending laughingstock joke as dude who has 20 copies of the same movie.
Yep, I think I'm up to 8 copies of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, at least. Although I can have 2 of the Arrow copies coming in, so that'll happen.
Yeah, I haven't factored those in yet because I'm like, okay, have these? People ask me, oh, well, what do you have the most copies of? I'm like, well, I got to think about it. I got to add it up. The Dollars films are up there. I think the record is still, well, I mean, Star Wars is up there too, of course, but I think the record is still Goldfinger and Thunderball because they have more releases than some of the other Bond films, and I don't quite want to admit how many copies I have.
I have one good story of the number. My record is this. I made a bootleg run of Blu-rays full with like a art and everything of the Ernst Lubitsch film 1 Hour with You. So on my peak, I had 24 identical Blu-ray copies of that movie that I had made from scratch.
Oh.
So that is my record, I think.
It's your limited print run for yourself.
Yeah, they were gifts for specific people who had supported the podcast, not financially, but with research and stuff. And yeah. I had so I made those as because a friend of mine always wanted a version of 1 Hour with You on Blu-ray that was tinted, and asked me if I could just burn him a disc. So I instead made a fake Criterion run with credits and everything.
Oh, of course.
And menu system.
I was like, why stop there?
Yeah, exactly. If you're gonna do that, you gotta go the whole hog.
Exactly.
That's probably the most embarrassing thing I'll admit to, as far as where it's it's tough to
no
top.
need to feel embarrassed. I mean, I've shown you what my notes are like when I watch a disc, and I'm just sitting there in the dark, fighting autocorrect, pausing every second, writing down timestamps, and it looks like I don't even know what to call it. And I'm like, oh, I didn't write that many, and I try to just convert it into a document, and I'm like, I wrote 17 pages. Oh dear.
Oh yes. It's a thing. It's a habit.
Well, to close things up, I guess I'll say it's time for everyone to visit wonderful, sunny San Miguel once again. It's a great tourist destination on the Aero UHD of A Fistful of Dollars. And then, if you're so inclined, you can then go hang out with El Indio and hope you don't get killed in the Aero UHD for a few dollars more. And then you'll just be waiting a little bit while longer for Tuco to put in his appearance with the Arrow UHD of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But to close this conversation, I just want to thank Devin for donating his time and generously coming on here to talk more about the nitty gritty aspects that went into making these Arrow releases the as definitive as they can be releases we never thought would happen or were possible. And I will have links to all of his information, his Lubitsch podcast, his letterbox, all that will be in the description below if you want to check that out, and also his excellent YouTube channel. So thanks to Devin for hanging out. Do you have any closing words?
I would say that I likewise, Spencer. You can find everyone. You can find Damn Fool Idealistic Crusader with the name of the channel that this is on. If you click that, you can find the rest of his videos. They're all incredible. Spencer, you're an absolute hero in this space, and thank you so much for doing all this, including this conversation, which was lovely and will certainly be a highlight of my whole week. So thank you again.
Oh, happy to do so. It's just, it's still weird to hear people say things like that because usually I'm just here talking into my camera and editing videos and doing video research until the wee small hours, just cramming in time, and then I'm going, I'm still doing this with these films. I've been doing this since I was a teenager. What am I doing?
Beats color grading commercials.
I can see that. Yeah.